like to introduce our first speaker, Linda Liebenberg. Linda is a leading researcher and evaluator in the field of youth well-being and community resilience. She's an adjunct professor with the Faculty of Graduate Sciences, Dalhousie University, and an international research affiliate at the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre, National University of Ireland. Linda's core interests relate to children and youth with complex needs. Her work explores the promotion of positive youth development and mental health, using formal and informal resources, primarily through the development of community resilience and related experiences. As a key component of this work, Linda reflects critically on the best ways in which to conduct research and evaluations with children and their communities, including multiple service providers. These approaches include participatory methods, sophisticated longitudinal quantitative designs, and the design of measurement instruments used with children and youth. Dr. Liebenberg has developed consulting and collaborative relationships with many international community-based organizations, including Save the Children Denmark, Eskasoni Mental Health Services, Right to Play, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the Public Health Association of Canada. She's presented on all 5 continents on culturally and contextually meaningful approaches to promoting positive psychosocial outcomes of children and youth, as well as the ways in which this research can be researched and evaluated. Finally, Linda is the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, where the special collection on constructions of children's voices will be published. Linda's talk is entitled Engaging Youth in Participatory Action Research Thematic Analysis. Thank you for joining us, Linda, and I'll turn over to you.
Thank you, Gail, for your wonderful introduction and for initiating this wonderful series of symposiums together with the related special issue of IJQM. And just before I start sharing my screen, a special thank you also to Dania Masler for your superlative work in these virtual symposium arrangements. Before delving into things, I want to say a very big thank you to the young people with whom I'm so privileged to work and who've been a huge inspiration for what I'm going to share with you today. The photographs included in this presentation are from some of the time we've spent together in Eskasoni, Unamagi, Cape Breton, and I use the images with the permission of the young people. Relatedly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you today from the unceded Mi'kmaq territory of Mi'kma'ki. The focus of my presentation today is on the engagement of children and youth in the analysis of data when conducting participatory action research. I share this process within the broader consideration of youth voice. Given the richness of the previous symposium series presentations, I won't go into the details of voice in this presentation today. Rather, I want to add to our thinking about voice and the ways in which we conduct data analysis, and specifically how this process of analysis impacts the integration of youth voice in the larger research process and related findings. So having said that, let's begin. Despite various advances in our thinking about research with children and youth, current discussions focus predominantly on design and data gathering. While discussions and the dissemination of findings is becoming stronger, spearheaded by authors such as Claudia Mitchell, who will be presenting after me, those focused specifically on data analysis and how to do this with children and youth remain limited. This is interesting because by not considering more thoughtfully the ways in which we integrate young people into the analysis of their data, we're impacting the positioning of what we refer to as youth voice in the continuity of the research process. This in turn raises questions about how we as researchers are in fact shaping the findings that are subsequently shared publicly. If we subscribe to the notion that voice is always socially embedded and socially constructed, then as researchers we need to be aware of micro and macro contexts in which those voices are situated and shaped. This includes not just the lived experiences that we're exploring with young people, but also the situating and shaping that occurs throughout the research process itself. Accordingly, we need to account for power structures across multiple social contexts and how this impacts the immediate positioning of youth voice, Within our studies, across various research activities, data analysis included. As Spiro 2011 explains, though children's voices are occasionally presented as speaking for themselves, a form of analysis is always undertaken, even if that is simply in the form of sorting and presenting quotes from what children said. A reflexive approach to data analysis asks what kind of analytical frameworks and categories the researcher imposes on children's voices. While he makes this observation in order to foster greater critical thought about how we as researchers approach, for example, qualitative data analysis, we extend on his argument here to youth participatory action research data analysis and ask, how do we refrain from or limit the imposition of our own frameworks on youth voice when working within PAR? Authentic youth participatory action research partnerships account for differential power structures in which knowledge is privileged and controlled. It is through this accounting that strong research findings are produced, findings that can be shared through intentional conduits of knowledge exchange. And this is the issue, with the focus on data analysis in particular, that this presentation responds to. So in the rest of this session, I'm going to share an example of youth participatory action data analysis using thematic data analysis specifically from the Spaces and Places study. While I will be sharing aspects of the study here today, in the interest of time, I'm not going to explain Spaces and Places in detail. We have published on aspects of the design and process, and you can read more about this study in these various publications. And you're welcome, of course, to contact me after the session with questions and further discussion points. That said, our process in Spaces and Places involved the use of image-based, photographic and video data gathering, combined with individual elicitation interviews. Individual interviews were followed by a focus group discussion that immediately led into data analysis, which in turn was followed by various dissemination activities. Before continuing, I think it's helpful at this stage to pause and reflect and consider what qualitative data analysis actually is. At the very least, qualitative data analysis is about organizing data, or coding, and distilling key ideas and concepts, developing themes that reoccur or appear significant either because of their presence or absence. Additionally, analysis is about establishing what most accurately reflects the focus of the research question, as well as, and perhaps most importantly, what is most important and most true to the people participating in the research. So analysis, thought of from this perspective, includes making decisions about what matters. And this, of course, raises the question of who is making these decisions. In Spaces and Places, we made use of thematic analysis to organize and distill the data into themes. We use thematic analysis as it is seen as being compatible with grounded theory as well as constructionist paradigms, both frameworks inherent to our original research design. Thematic analysis is a means of producing thick descriptions of emerging themes through a process of coding and systematizing data, much like the one I've explained here. While thematic analysis does not attempt to develop a theory, as in the case of grounded theory, it does result in a conceptually informed interpretation of the data. Accordingly, we see this as a meaningful approach to ensuring collaborative development of a data analysis framework with youth, a framework that could produce immediate findings and inform additional analysis of the data. So returning to our own process, we made use of Braun and Clark's 6 steps of thematic analysis, which include familiarization with the data, the generation of initial codes, the identification of themes that reflect these collections of codes, reviewing the data to understand and explain the meaning and the dynamics of the themes, maintaining rigor through intercoder agreement, and producing the final report. Importantly, within our youth participatory action research process, we used Paulo Freire's argument for working in groups as a pedagogical tool to underpin the format in which we do analysis. We also shaped the process using the SHOWED framework developed by Schaefer in 1983 and discussed extensively by Wang and Burris in their 1997 publication Photo Voice. So what did this look like in our process? First, youth familiarized one another with their data through the use of analog Facebook pages in which they shared images and themes of their individual interviews that they believed were pertinent to the study. They also explored the content of the Facebook pages in more depth with focus group discussions, providing an additional opportunity to become familiar with each other's data. To generate initial codes, we then asked youth to engage in a series of community and body mapping exercises. These exercises were linked to the focus of the study, specifically places that made youth feel they belong to their community, thus the community maps, and how places and relational spaces support youth to be happy and healthy, thus the body maps. Youth were asked specifically to draw on the content of their individual interviews when developing and discussing the maps. As youth discussed their data in focus group discussions and mapping activities, other members of the research team harvested or captured the words youth were using. These words were then placed on cards and integrated into a sort of card sort game. The game allowed the youth to identify relevant codes, sort codes into groups, and identify themes related to the groups. Youth then discussed the relationships between themes, highlighting their meaning and dynamics. Intercoder agreement was established in two ways. First, via the consistent group discussions between youth of codes, code groups, and themes. And second, through the use of energizer and check-in activities throughout the analysis process. Finally, youth shared their findings with communities via various art-based projects, targeted service provider reports, conference presentations, and academic publications. To recap, through this process, youth could bring the knowledge of their own data to the analysis. Drawing on various activities, they then generated codes and themes as a group and identified the ways in which themes relate to one another. Energizer and check-in activities prompted further reflection on the process. Similarly, the research team could use statements made by the youth in the discussion of codes and the development of themes, encouraging youth to reflect more deeply on the data. Critical to the analytical discussion was the group format in which it occurred. In this setting, youth were able to unpack each other's perspectives and explore in more detail the positioning of their respective understanding of socially embedded experiences, as well as establish agreement with each other regarding the emerging themes and findings. In conclusion then, including youth in the data analysis process ensures their collective voice remains central to findings, repositioning and possibly even subduing the voice of the researchers. This is in large part because it is the framework of findings developed by youth collaborators themselves, rather than the researcher, that drives and shapes the findings that are disseminated. Perhaps more importantly, the process creates the opportunity to consider in more depth the social constructions and positioning of youth voices, better ensuring that findings more accurately reflect youth experiences as well as youth voice. Thank you so much for joining the session today. And as previously said, please don't hesitate to contact me at the email address provided here with questions or further discussion points about what I've shared today. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. What an interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'd like to get us started with a question about the analysis. It feels, especially from some of my background doing research with young people, that data generating and analysis were sort of merged, but perhaps not. So can you talk a little bit more about how the analysis is different than data generating?
Absolutely. I think it's an important question because definitely the tools that we used to develop codes and themes are tools that are often used to generate data. So there's an absolute overlap there. I think what really separates the two is the intention. So we had gone through a research process before we started the data analysis, where young people engaged with the visual prompts created through photographs and video to participate in fairly extensive individual interviews. They averaged an hour, and each young person was interviewed twice, once about the photographs, once about the videos. So, and the process of making the photos and the videos prior to the interviews, the youth did that. And so that those activities, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm speaking in riddles here, but the process of making the photographs and the videos facilitated reflection on their experiences. And then during the individual interviews, there was this articulation of these reflections. So that was the data generating piece. Once we moved into the group format to analyze the data, the emphasis was always on think about your interviews. Think about the things you said in your interviews and bring that information into this process. And so as the team in the interviews, we were responding in a way that was intended to generate data. Once we got into the group format, the emphasis was on taking that data and generating codes and themes. So the difference is subtle, but I think it's where that emphasis was and what we were looking for in each of the two processes that mattered.
Yeah, so the focus was different in each of the two processes. So I think for some people, they're used to analysis being primarily focused on analyzing transcripts. What would you say about, like, why not just ask the young people in the study to analyze their own transcripts? Why work on these other activities to bring the group together?
That's another excellent question. And I do know of studies where people have asked of adolescents in particular to actually analyze transcripts. But I also know that those studies were done in a very different context. And it's interesting for me because right from the get-go in the study, I was very concerned about how we were going to engage young people in the study, feeling, based on prior research experiences in the communities, that that process of reading and coding wasn't going to work. And I think if we step back as researchers and we're honest about it, we'll admit that coding transcripts is a really arduous task. It's very labor intensive. And I think when it's not your job, to quote the young people in the study, it could probably be really boring. Why am I doing this? And it was interesting because in the course of the research, a lot of the youth in their individual interviews spoke about how boring they found school. Because school is sedentary and you're sitting at a desk and they spoke very much about the importance of being active and being out on the land and being in communities. I should mention that I didn't mention this in the presentation, but all three communities that participated were Indigenous communities. And so culturally, it was really important for the young people to be active and out in the land. And that really reaffirmed that idea of please don't ask these young people to code their transcripts. They weren't even interested in reading their transcripts for accuracy. They're just like, no, I said what mattered, it's fine. So I think that that's the big thing of just realistically, what are we asking of young people? And then ethically, to impose that kind of arduous task on their time. And what kind of engagement are we going to get back? And so that for me really highlighted the need to do this in a way that resonated with the young people themselves and their activities. And on that note, I should say the card game was actually an idea that emerged from watching the youth in downtime around the fieldwork. In one of the sites we were working out of a youth center, and what we found was the youth would arrive early for the research, they'd leave much longer after we'd ended, and oftentimes they would sit around playing card games. And it was watching them doing that that inspired the actual card game activity, finding something that they enjoyed doing and integrating that into the process.
Sorry, I continue to not unmute myself. I'm going to move to a couple of questions from the audience. Karen Onions has asked, did you have any surprises when the young people got involved and what they came up with during the data analysis?
Yes. Oh my goodness, I just had a flood of thoughts go through my head. I was surprised, even though we had tried to find fun activities that resonated with the young people, I was really taken back by their commitment and their engagement to the process. And similarly, I was surprised by their commitment and engagement to sharing the findings afterwards. I think the process of engaging young people in the analysis solidified their ownership of the research in a way that hadn't happened through the data gathering process. So that was one of the surprises. And secondly, especially in the one site, the depths the young people went to in their analysis, where in my presentation I say, you know, thematic analysis doesn't necessarily produce a theory the way grounded theory does. In the one site in particular, the young people really pushed the analysis that far that we're busy working on a publication at the moment, and I would argue that there is a theory in there. At the very least, what the young people have said comes very, very close to mirroring other theories that exist. So that depth and level of engagement and commitment, there were long days in that particular site as well. It was hot, you know, the peak of summer, and here were these young people who were so committed to what we were doing and pushing the process like that. And the last thing, of course, is young people's wisdom. They really do have such incredibly rich insights into what they need and what works for them. And we're so quick as adults, I think, to dismiss. And I'm thinking back to Franco's presentation in the first seminar and Michaela's, you know, we're so quick to dismiss young people, and yet they're so wise, and they have such a good handle on what they need if we just give them the space to be serious and own the process. So thank you for the question.
Here's another from Dawn Pickering, who I know is joining us from Wales today. Dawn asks, what did you feel the photographs added to the data? Did it engage the young people more than reading words like transcripts?
I think the short answer to that is yes. What I've found with photographs in the past, where I've done photo elicitation studies, I've often found the photographs in and of themselves don't produce that much data. What they really do is they form placeholders for people in the reflection on the taken for granted day-to-day experiences. That when they come into the interview process, they've got these almost post-it notes that serve as a reminder to what matters in their lives, and you know, the deep reflection that they've had prior to the interview, which of course enriches the interview data that we receive as researchers. And what I found interesting in this process was the way in which those placeholders then moved from that interview space, where it was an initial prompt around a richer narrative, into the analysis space, where the photographs became a prompt to that richer narrative that the youth had shared in their interviews. So it prompted the interview, and then it prompted the data sharing in the analysis. But it also, in the talking of the photographs, did initiate, youth would then ask each other questions around the photographs and the interview data that the youth was sharing. And at times youth would pick up on what was shared from the interview data, but at other times they would pick up on things in the photographs and ask questions around that. So they definitely served a very, very important purpose in the process.
We have a couple of COVID-related questions, no surprise. One from Sydney Campbell, and I want to just put a shout out to Sydney Campbell. I know that she's been boosting us on Twitter, so thank you, Sydney. And here's her question. In a context of COVID, do you have recommendations on how this engaged and collaborative analysis approach might be translated to a virtual space?
Oh my goodness.
Big
If I'm being,
question.
yes, if I'm being honest, I really dislike virtual spaces. I've come at all of this very reluctantly. Um, but I think at the same time, you know, as a society, we seem to have taken to virtual work and functioning in a virtual space so seamlessly that I can see it working. I just think, again, it would be important, whether we're working in a virtual space or in a physical space with each other. I think it's really important to always think about the appropriateness of the activities and the tools that we're using in relation to the research participants / collaborators when we're doing a YPAR work. So how appropriate are our tools and mechanisms in relation to the young people themselves, as well as our research question in the space we're working in. So I can see situations where, for example, even if we're in a physical space together, community mapping or body mapping wouldn't work because it wouldn't be relevant to a question or to the group we're working with. So I think that's the trick, is to really think creatively and outside the box about the tools we're using. And of course, a virtual space is just another space that we're working in. And so to think about, you know, what would work best in those spaces. I think that's a very vague answer to a question that I find challenging.
Let's move to another question then. Heather Demon says, thank you for your great presentation. Can you describe the ways in which the gaze or frame of the photos or videos might have influenced the voice of the young people?
Well, the young people made the photographs themselves. So the photographs are their gaze on their community. And it's an interesting question, because that's exactly why we included the video component. Video footage was created by, they say, non-youth members of the research team. So students, academic members, together with community members who would be working for a local mental health service provider. They would work in teams of 2 to produce the video footage. And what they would do is film the young people for as much of a day in their lives as possible in their community context and home context. And the idea there was to actually shift the gaze of young people outside of themselves. So what we would do is we'd create 30-minute compilations of the young people's days that we'd share back with the young people and use that as the prompts in the elicitation interview. And specifically to give young people almost a bird's eye view of themselves and their interaction with their environment. That's not to say that the gaze of the non-youth members of the research team didn't shape that footage. We did try and balance that as much as possible by keeping more of a wide focus, so not zooming in close, keeping a wide focus that really was just wherever the young person was moving, documenting their interaction with their context. And then, of course, our gaze shaped what was selected in those 30-minute compilations. What was interesting there was at the end of those elicitation interviews about the video footage, we'd ask young people if there was anything included in the compilation from their day that surprised them, and anything that happened in their day that wasn't included that they would have included. And what surprised the young people was that we were so interested in their lives. So that was the blanket response. It's crazy that you would follow us around for a day with a video camera, but what was really interesting was the fact that young people weren't commenting on a piece of their day that they would have included that we hadn't. So I think we managed to balance that out fairly well, especially because we were interdisciplinary teams creating the compilations rather than individuals. But I think through that process, the hope is that we kept the gaze of the young people themselves central to the process.
Thanks, Linda. I'm sure that there are just so many questions we could continue with. I'm going to end with one further one from our audience, and this is from Katie Ma, who presented last week. She says, "Thank you for an interesting talk, Dr. Liebenberg, and the insight you've provided regarding the role of young people in data analysis. I was wondering if you can please speak a bit more to the researcher role in data analysis." So I guess it's, balancing this youth role or youth voice with the researcher.
Yeah. That's actually interesting, and we have sort of published on this, not with regard specifically to the analysis piece, but to the research process overall. And it's included in the references that I provided in the presentation. But I think starting with that, the process overall, what I really realized over the course of this research and across the 3 communities is that everybody on the team, so the researcher, the community partners, and the young people themselves, all brought specific skills to the larger process and specific knowledge. And the ways in which owning our skills and our knowledge linked in with owning our various responsibilities in the process, which I think, Katie, comes back to your question, and the ways in which that really, really strengthened and enriched the process. I think sometimes when we do participatory action research, they can, for various reasons, there can be a tendency to, as an academic researcher, to step back from the process too far and almost put too much on the participants. Say, well, I don't want to interfere with the process, so you go do this. And I really realized in this process with the young people, and as I say, across the 3 sites, how that's really not the right approach to take. Because we have, and I think Brenda commented on this in her presentation on Tuesday, we have extensive training in how to do research, and there's a reason for that. And we bring this wealth of knowledge and these skills to the process. And it is our responsibility to make sure that we present good research options to the rest of the team in ways that make sense. But it's our responsibility to at least distill the list of options down to, based on our knowledge, what works well with this question in this context, but then translate that process to our partners in ways that gets rid of the academic jargon and makes it accessible so that they can make really well-informed decisions about how to move forward with the process. And then once that planning stage is done, I think, again, as researchers, it's our responsibility to make sure that the process stays on track as a research process rather than a community problem-solving process or just something people are doing for fun, and, at the risk of really undermining a lot of things, but to make sure that that research piece stays there. And again, making sure all the way through that we're taking from our knowledge and our expertise and translating that and sharing it with our partners in the research in ways that they can really draw on in a well-informed way. Just the same way we need to learn and listen and be open to what our community partners are telling us in terms of what works and doesn't work in their context and the information and the knowledge that they hold. So, and I think within the data analysis process, that was really important too, that we spend a lot of time before we got to the data analysis workshops thinking through critically, what is the process? What are we trying to achieve at the end of the day? And how do we translate that into activities that will resonate with the youth so that it's not just a fun weekend that involves lots of pizza and things like that. But I think the trick is to do it in ways that we don't look like academics out of an ivory tower, that we make this process very accessible to our partners to keep it authentic and rich.
Thank you, Linda. Again, as I said, I'm sure there are many more questions, but If you're tuning in, you'll see that Linda's contact information is in the chat, and you can certainly follow up. We will also keep track of that chat, and you will have an opportunity in completing the survey at the end if you'd like to connect further with Linda about the kinds of things and the research that she's been doing. Thank you, Linda, very much.